In this podcast, I'm going to go through the content that you'll need to revise for your Year 7 test on Anglo-Saxon England, or what life was like before 1066, the claims to the throne of England in 1066 upon the death of Edward the Confessor, the events of 1066, and then how William, from becoming king, kept control of the Anglo-Saxon population and how the Normans ruled England. So, England in 1066 was ruled by Anglo-Saxon kings. The last Anglo-Saxon king of England was Harold, but he was defeated, of course, by William of Normandy. But the Anglo-Saxons originated from North Germany, southern Denmark, and they settled in England hundreds of years before that, as the Romans left in about the 4th or 5th century. And they came and they settled and they farmed. They brought with them they brought with them language. Initially they were pagan in nature, but many of them converted to Christianity throughout the centuries that followed. So by 1066 we've got a culture that depends very much on, but you have a king, and the king has control of certain areas with regards to loyalty from local Witan chiefs, the local council chiefs that would work with the king. Village life was pretty much stable, and it had been for hundreds of years, where predominantly farming communities would live in very simple houses. Life was often difficult, but at the same time that stability brought this notion of continuity to the Anglo-Saxon peoples. Now in 1066, an Anglo-Saxon king, the only interruption to the Anglo-Saxon way of life had been the intermittent invasions by the Vikings from Norway. We do see a series of Viking kings in Anglo-Saxon England as well. The Anglo-Saxons were warriors as well, and there is evidence, there isn't much evidence of Anglo-Saxon England, but what evidence there are of weapons. If any of you are interested, there's lots of information out there about the Anglo-Saxon horde that shows that actually this culture was quite sophisticated. Because very little has been written about this time, it's about notionally piecing together what evidence there is from what's been found in the earth. A lot of the buildings that were built there, unless they were church buildings, and there are a few Anglo-Saxon churches around. In fact, the village that I grew up in is a very old pre-Norman church, and there's very little evidence there. Edward the Confessor was one of the last Anglo-Saxon kings, and he died childless. He didn't have an heir to the throne, and what we see in 1066 is that William of Normandy, Harold Hardrada of Norway, and Harold Godwinson, the Englishman, all stake claim to the throne of England, all for very different reasons. Harold Godwinson, the Englishman, claims that on his deathbed, Edward the Confessor swore that he would hand the throne over to him. William of Normandy, however, stated that many years prior to this, maybe 10 years prior to this, that Edward the Confessor had said that upon his death, William of Normandy would become King of England. And in fact, the Bayeux Tapestry tells us that Godwinson himself had agreed to this, and in fact Godwinson visited William in Normandy to this effect. Hardrada's claim is a bit more tenuous, but it dates back to the old Viking king's claim of maybe 20-30 years previously, and many ways you could argue that Hardrada's claim is just opportune, that he's looking for a way to expand the Nordic Empire into England to make it for his own. Now, upon the death of Edward, Harold makes himself king. William begins making plans to invade. The Bayeux Tapestry talks about how their invasion fleet was amassed on the northern coast of Normandy. Harold is expecting this, and he places his troops loyal to him on the south coast. Now what we see over the late summer, early summer, and midsummer of 1066 is that the wind is not favourable to William's assault. What we do see, however, is an invasion in the north of England by Harold Hardrada with the aid of Godwinson's brother Tostig, and they land in the north of England and they begin causing trouble. This means that Harold has to then march north and deal with this threat from the Vikings, and they fight a pitched battle at Stamford Bridge where Hardrada is murdered or is killed in battle, and the Vikings are routed and they have to flee back to Norway and they're defeated. While that's happening, the wind changes direction and William could land, then send his invasion fleet across the channel with horses and weaponry, and they land on the south coast of a place called Pevensey in Sussex. So Harold has to about face and march quickly several hundred miles back down to stave off this invasion. They meet just outside Hastings on Senlac Hill, and Harold positions himself on the ridge with his shield wall to block the way for William to move forward. On the 14th of October, we see the Battle of Hastings. William initially is unsuccessful in trying to break down the shield wall. And actually, as the day progresses, it looks as though the English might be successful. However, what we see is that at one point in the battle, the wall itself loses its integrity, and members of the wall start running down the hill thinking that they've got the Normans beat. So what this enables the Normans to do is to feint a series of retreats, thinking to give the impression to the English that they're retreating, and it enables the Norman horsemen to get in behind the shield wall on top of the hill and defeat the English. And the English are massacred at the end of the day, including Harold himself. He's killed in the battlefield. So, with Harold dead and most of the nobles of Anglo-Saxon England killed at Hastings, this paves the way for William eventually, by Christmas, to be crowned King of England at the end of 1066. But by then, it's by no means certain that the Normans are going to control the whole of England. So how do they control the English in the years after? Well, firstly, they build castles, lots of them. Initially of wood. We have the Motte and Bailey castles, and the castles afford the Normans protection and allow them to pool their resources to keep their soldiers safe from the English local population. Castles are often built in important places, so they're built on river junctions, road junctions, close to Anglo-Saxon settlements. And it enables the Normans to use the castles very much like medieval police stations, where they can send soldiers out, they can arrest and bring Anglo-Saxons back into the castle and deal justice that way. Castles are extremely effective. As time moves on, they build stronger, more fortified castles. We move to the Square Keep Castle, and a good example of a Square Keep Castle is the Tower of London, which is a 11th century Norman castle. Square Keep, built of stone, strong structure. As time moves on, over many years, we move on to concentric castles where the towers become round, we see curtain walls. So over time, castles become very, very effective and defensive methods of keeping control, because they're essentially impregnable. They cannot be destroyed by the local population. In fact, the only way to kind of get to defeat a castle is to lay siege to it, to starve the inhabitants out. So alongside castles, William also uses the feudal system to control England. This is whereby we have several hundred French nobles, Norman nobles, who are given sections of the country to control for themselves, and they're given that land in response to owing loyalty or fealty to homage to the king himself. That means that William can rely on these nobles or tenants in chief to form an army if needed to fight off any invasion or any internal threat from the English. So the tenants in chief, the nobles, are given this land, the barons, and they have to then administer that land themselves. And they use trusted military commanders, knights, to command certain areas of their control. And the knights are given land. In return, they have to provide military service to the tenants in chief. At the very bottom of this, you have the English themselves who live in the village, and they have their land taken off them by the Normans. They no longer own this land, and they are essentially paying rent to the local landlords, either the knights or the tenants in chief, in return for supposed protection and safety. And so the peasants at the bottom, villains, some of them are known as serfs, they have to work for several days of the year on the Lord's manor and provide food and services, and all this money eventually finds its way back up to the king. And this structure lasts in England for several hundred years, and it's the way in which several foreign Normans can control the millions of English population through controlling the land. Because the Normans own the land, the English are disempowered. They have no power over the Normans. Another way in which the Normans keep control is through the use of terror. And one good example is the harrowing of the north. We see a number of uprisings in the north of England against against William and later Norman rulers. And this forces the Normans to act quite aggressively to make sure that the Anglo-Saxons toe the line, that they stay in control. And what they do in 1069, 1070 is that they burn the crops of the north of England, in Yorkshire in particular, which leads to mass famine. Estimates put it over 100,000 locals are killed in that winter, and that has a massive impact on the long-term social growth of the north of England. What it means is that it deals a death blow to any resistance to William, and it makes people remind them of the strength of the Normans, that you don't mess with them. And the final way in which the Normans kept control was through the use of knowledge and power and money. William conducted a huge survey, because William needed to know that at any one time he needed to tax the people of England to fight wars. And so they conducted a survey, and this survey of all villages, all assets, all things of any worth in England that could be used to fight against any external threats. And this survey was known as the Domesday Book, eventually when all of it was collected. And this enabled William to have an inventory, a list of everything that was worth anything in the country, so that he could prepare for battle. So there we have it. Anglo-Saxon England, the claims to the throne of 1066, the events of 1066, and then finally the how the William and the Normans kept control. Good luck in your test. This 11-minute podcast should go some way in helping you prepare for that.